So welcome. This is Let's Get Uncomfortable, how to ask for and process feedback. My name is Corey Nesland. I'm a program manager with Palantir.net. I've been with them for almost 3 years, but in a previous life, I worked in a completely different industry doing a completely different thing. And that is what started me on my feedback journey. So I wanted to tell a little story about why the feedback process is important to me in general. At the company I used to work for, we did not have any formal feedback process. We just had quarterly graphs. So an anonymous survey would go out, everyone's name would be listed, and anyone could fill out a survey about feedback for you. These were not the 2 actual questions that were part of the graph, but this was what we all knew to be the questions. So as a social group, we all panicked the days that these were supposed to be released. And you can see there's essentially 2 questions. Do you like this person? Because this was asking about, do you want to have this person on your team? And then the bottom one was, if it was your money, would you give this person a raise? Which is an interesting way for the business to try and frame a feedback conversation. And then all of these little dots are your coworkers. So if you were in a Scrum team, you literally are ranked by every single person, and the dark gray dot is you. So if this is your feedback system, maybe if you're one of those top dots, you're like, okay, but there's no formal feedback at all. There's no performance review, nothing. At the end of the year, you would just get your promotion, raise, whatever, spit out of essentially like a black box, and this is all you had. But what happens if you're this person, right? If you're this person, you have no idea what you're supposed to be doing differently. And you're taking this super personally because everyone knows that these are essentially the meanings behind these 2 questions. So I did this for several years, and it did not do good things to me. So I said, you know what, as far as feedback goes, at my next place, I'm going to take more control over how I get feedback and specifically what information I'm going to look for. So what I just showed you is an example of leader-led feedback. That's from the company. It's from their perspective to do whatever it is that they want to do, and it's largely fear-based. So when we have leader-led feedback, it means that the person who's receiving it isn't in control of the information that's coming to them. They're just accepting whatever the business is going to put on them. So what's in scope for today? We're going to talk about why you should take control of the feedback process if you haven't done that already, what being feedback positive means, how to actually ask for feedback, and then how to assess it. So we're going to go through a real example that's my actual feedback from one of the rounds of feedback that I've done at Palantir. So be gentle because it's definitely not edited. And then what's out of scope for today is how to give feedback to others. That is a completely different conversation and has a completely different set of rules attached to it. So, assumptions. Since this is a how-to class, if you're interested in trying to get feedback through this method, we're going to start with a couple of assumptions. One is that you know your situation best, so you know if this will work for you or not, or how you would need to change it. 2, you're capable of adopting a growth mindset. We'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second. 3, you work in an environment where it's safe to ask for feedback. That graph thing that I showed you, that's not an environment that's safe to ask for feedback. But where I'm at now, it definitely is. So you'll be able to make that assessment yourself. And then you're able to assess the validity of feedback provided to you. We will talk about that in more detail in a later slide. So, why should you take ownership of the feedback process? When we forfeit our right to choose, we allow ourselves to be pulled in directions we don't want to go. Again, this whole conversation is not talking about your yearly performance review. It's not talking about what's attached to your promotion. It's talking about the kind of feedback that you would like to have so that you can benefit yourself in your own career. So kind of what's the difference? The graph one that I showed you is a very hostile way of showing traditional feedback. This is compulsory, it's reactive, it's from the business, it's for their purposes only. And depending on the feedback you get and the skill of the person who's giving you feedback, it can trigger the fight, flight, or freeze response in you, especially if you didn't see it coming at all, which traditional feedback very regularly has that side effect. And then self-driven is goal-focused. It's proactive because it's based off you and your needs, and what you're assessing is the best set of questions or path for investigation for you at the time. So in order to be successful in this method, you kind of have to adopt a feedback positive mindset, which I think if you're only used to traditional feedback might be a little bit hard. It's a little bit difficult, or at least it was for me, to separate good feedback from negative feedback, or trying to figure out like what is the intent of what someone is saying to me. But if you're going to be feedback positive, with which this method kind of requires, you want to view feedback as an opportunity. It's not an attack on you necessarily. It's an opportunity for you to decide, what does the broader environment think of my work and where are areas where I could grow. You need to accept responsibility for your growth, meaning that if you ask people for feedback in this method and then don't do anything about it, it will kind of ding your credibility. So you need to accept responsibility for making changes for feedback that you deem is valid. And then being feedback positive also means that you're going to exercise your agency as a person with your own goals and standards, which is why I'm saying that when you start this process, your goals should be at the top of your mind. So you're choosing to know on your terms in order to advance your own personal goals, not the goals necessarily of the business. So how do you actually ask for feedback? And what does that look like? Well, there's a cycle. Fantastic. You don't get to do this just once. Once you start it, you should keep going. So step one is planning. It's identifying what your goals are, choosing the format that you're going to ask for feedback with, and then selecting your questions. Once you've done that, you'll complete the action, which is getting the feedback, obviously. Then you'll assess it, which is, looking at all the responses that you've received and figuring out what feedback is valid and what you would like to adopt. The growth step is figuring out what your action items are from that assessed feedback, and then you iterate. So again, you don't go through this cycle one time, you go through this multiple times. I've generally found that like every 6 months is a pretty good timetable, because it's long enough where something material could have happened, where someone could give you actual feedback, but it's not so frequent that people are going to be like, why are you coming to me every 3 months or whatever, asking these same questions? Nothing has changed. So this is generally the cycle that you'll want to go with if you're picking this up. So what's the step plan? So we're in the planning stage. Step one is identifying your goals. Step two is choosing the format. Step three is selecting your questions. So when you're deciding to go and get feedback, you kind of have 4 buckets of options that you could do. You could ask in the moment feedback. This is just like if you did a presentation or you just delivered a ticket, like, hey, how did I do? Is this okay? Do you have any, I don't know. Is there anything that I could have done better that would have made this, I don't know, closer to what you were looking for? This isn't too heavy because it's right after the action has occurred. So you can ask this fairly regularly. Not all the time, because that's too much. But if you've definitely done something new and you're curious how it landed, go for it in the moment. My personal favorite is short interviews, which is the second one. This is just 15-minute meetings with 3 targeted questions generally, because you don't have time for more than 3 questions in a short interview. I know a lot of us are busy, and adding more meetings to the calendar does not sound like the best thing ever. But if you're able to have a face-to-face conversation, either in person or virtually, this is a really good option. The deep dive is spending 30 minutes on a one-on-one discussion. This doesn't necessarily have like the same questions set up. You're having a real fact-finding discussion with the person that you're talking to. Realistically, if you're going to go the deep dive route, you can only talk to like 2 or 3 people maximum, right? Because for you, that's an hour and a half of your day, not to mention all the prep work that goes into it. It's not feasible to do a deep dive with like your entire Scrum team, for example. But short interviews are. If you wanted to find out from every team member, which I've done, kind of what their impression is, the short interview definitely works. And then if you've never really asked for feedback before and you're a little bit nervous, the feedback survey is an option. So The downside of the feedback survey is that it can come off as a little bit impersonal, and you may not have a very good response rate depending on how many people you send it out to. But if you're just wanting to dip your toe into it, it's totally okay to start here. I don't recommend doing this more than once. So if you need an easy entry point, definitely go with the feedback survey, but then move to one of the others in the future once you feel like you've got a little bit of psychological safety with the responses that you've gotten. Any questions about any of this so far? Okay. So then what should you ask? Well, again, you should tie your questions to your goals. What's important for you to know? If you're about to come up into a promotion cycle, your questions might be different than if you just joined a new team and you've only been with this stable team for 6 months and you want to see how it's going. Or maybe you are looking to make a switch into a different field, or you want to target a specific skill set and you need to know where you're at on that path. You want to refrain from questions which can be answered with a yes or no. That makes a lot of sense, right? Because most of the time, if you ask a yes or no question, especially around feedback, and you say, do you have any feedback for me? The answer is going to be no, because no one wants to put themselves out there. But if instead you say, what feedback do you have for me? It does not allow the respondent to come back with a no, because it implies that they have feedback and that you're asking for it. And then consider action-oriented questions. I always have at least one of these when I do my short interviews, because they kind of require the person to think a little bit more than just, oh, it'd be great if you communicated more, like something more specific than that. So now you've determined your goals, you've selected the format that you're going to do. So now you move on to actually getting the feedback. This is actually scheduling the meetings. Yeah, go ahead.
Just a thought on the previous slide.
Yeah.
If you're going to go in with questions like that, would you recommend sharing them with the person beforehand?
Yeah, just for the recording, he asked if you should share the questions beforehand. And yes, I do. So I work in a 100% virtual company. So when I send the meeting invite, I put all 3 questions on there well in advance so that someone can think about it. Definitely do that if you can. It will be quite helpful. At the same time, when I send that out, I also tell the person, hey, I'm looking for actual honest feedback. So don't feel like you have to phone it in when we have this conversation. If there's something you want to tell me, you can absolutely tell me. At this point, I've done this enough times that my team already knows that, but it's really important to say the first time that you go and ask for feedback, or even the second time, just to make sure that the person really is comfortable. But yeah, that's a great question. Definitely send it to them in advance if you can. In the moment, you can't send it in advance, but. All right, so then you're gonna go and get the feedback. You're gonna schedule the meetings, excuse me. You're going to have it, and you're going to collect the data. And now we get into the exciting part, which is my actual feedback, not quite yet. Sorry, I lied. All right. So important notes before you start the feedback process. Check in with yourself before starting. If you are not in an emotional space where you are prepared to hear critical feedback, don't start this process. Wait until you feel like you can listen to it. It's totally okay and 100% normal to feel nervous or tense or scared. That feeling tends to decrease the more that you do this. So the first time it's probably going to be the worst, or maybe with your boss it's going to be harder than with a coworker. And then remember that an individual's opinion is only their opinion. You're just asking them from their perspective what they think. It doesn't make it true necessarily. And then, like I said, share with them that you're looking for honest feedback. This seems kind of like obvious, maybe like low stakes, but the reality is like if you state it specifically, you're much more likely to get that feedback than if you don't state it. It's not as implied as you think it is unless you affirmatively tell them, hey, I want honest feedback. And then the big one is that feedback is not an evaluation of your intrinsic value or identity, and you are the only one who can determine whether or not this feedback has value. Feedback is just the verbalization of someone else's experience of you. That doesn't make it true. That also doesn't mean that we just straight up ignore everything that everybody says. It's just important to note that You're still yourself regardless of what anyone says. Okay, so now we have picked our goals, picked our format, we've had our actual feedback session, so now we're in the assessment stage. So we're going to compile our results, we're going to review, and then there's 3 subsets through there, which is what's the context of the information, what's the bias of the respondents, if any, and then what's your own bias towards what you've heard. And then step 7 is decide what information to accept or reject. This is completely up to you what you want to pick. Any questions yet before we get into the practical part? Okay. So this is real example. This is, I think, from my second round of feedback. And this is the compile step. So this is just everything that everybody told me. All 3 answers for all 3 questions in a row is 1 person. And you can see the 3 questions that I asked at the top. So a lot of good stuff here. So now that I've put it all in a chart, I'm going to go in and I'm going to assess the context and I'm going to identify if there's any bias. So the 3 ones in yellow are a context call out for me. So one, when they say nothing identified, this could be true, but it's also possible that the person does not feel psychologically safe enough with you to give you critical feedback. And it's okay if that's the case. You might want to include this person again in the future after you've shown that you demonstrate growth from the feedback that you do receive. And then the 2 on the right, the creating a retrospective template bank and rebalancing team shape, technically, maybe there's something that I could do there, but this is outside of the scope of my job. So I might have some influence in these areas, but this isn't really feedback associated with me personally. This is just an ask that someone is asking me to do for them. And then we have the top one. In some circumstances, be less chatty. Okay, that is true. But I have a biased response to that, right? Because I don't want to hear that people want me to, be quiet some more, but that is valid. So I'm going to identify that, hey, like I had a response to that. It's from me, not from the other person. And so I'm going to note it. I'm going to explicitly tell myself, hey, you're responding to that from your own bias. And then I have another one that says communicate less. So I am a program manager. I do project management. I'm a scrum master. I cannot do this. This is a bias problem with the person that I'm talking to because our relationship is not as solid as other members of the team. So I know what this person is saying is they want me to leave them alone or communicate less with them, but that I cannot do by virtue of my role and their role on the scrum team. So I know that this is their bias coming out. This is not an actionable thing for me. So this part is kind of the hardest, is identifying the bias, especially when it's your bias. It's very easy to say, oh, this other person just, has this response to me for X, Y, and Z reason. But picking out the stuff that you're responding to can be a bit of hard work. So then I make a decision about what feedback I'm going to accept or reject. In the gray, that's again, there's nothing there or it's outside of the scope of my job. Yellow is, I'll consider that. That's a task that I could pick up if I wanted to, but it's not a requirement. Red is, I'm going to reject that, right? Because it's coming from a biased place and I can't operate on it. And green is ones that I'm going to accept. So you can see that in some circumstances, be less chatty, even though I had a response to that, I'm going to accept that as valid. And they're probably right that in some contexts, I should give more space to others in the room. So now what? So now we're going to determine what our action items are, and we're going to then implement them. So like I said before, when you start this, it's not just about information gathering, it's also about actions that come out of it. If you start a feedback process, especially when it's self-initiated, and then you don't make any improvements, the next time you do this, people are going to know you weren't serious. You're just, maybe scoping for information. So for me, specifically, from the feedback that I received, I picked these 3 action items. So these are directly tied to the feedback that I accepted, and they are very kind of clear to me on ways that I can demonstrate this behavior and show it to others so that they know that I'm actioning on that feedback. In the case of the be more self-aware and the looking for opportunities to loop in team members, I actually said this to my team. I said, hey, these are 2 things I'm going to really try to do. Please hold me accountable if you see me not doing them. If I'm not, if I'm being exclusionary, which doesn't really happen, but like if I'm doing that, let me know. And if I'm talking too much, which does happen, also let me know. So by doing that, I've also built up more of my credibility because they know I went through the feedback process, I chose the action items, and then I'm saying publicly, hey, I'm not the only one who's going to hold me accountable. You are also, as my team, empowered to hold me accountable. And then repeat. Because I think we've talked about this a couple times. You can't do it just once. You need to keep doing it. Maybe every 6 months is too frequent for you. Maybe it's every year, but definitely do this. All right. So thank you so much. I think we kind of flew through that. There is a list of resources, I think, attached to that QR code. There's also just a survey about whether or not you found any of this information valuable. But yeah, Q&A. I don't know if you guys have any questions or anything. Cool.
Question.
Yeah.
You mentioned at one point about having these kinds of conversations with your boss.
Mm-hmm.
Would you recommend having the same process with people who report to you? And if so, should the approach be any different?
Yeah, so the question was, does the approach change depending on the position of the person that you're talking to, like your boss versus someone who reports to you? I don't. Palantir is a little bit different in that it's a flat structure, but as my role holds accountabilities, that means that I can go to other people and say, hey, where is this thing? There's a little bit of that. I don't actually change my approach at all because I want every person who I work with in any capacity to feel like they can tell me when I'm doing something either really great or something that's detrimental. And I have spent the last 2 years really building that psychological safety with my team, which is actually the session that myself and another one of my colleagues in that same team are going to talk about this afternoon about building psychological safety. But because we have that, it makes this whole thing a lot easier to do. Because the inherent trust that I'm not going to do anything bad with the information is there.